Thank you very much for having us present here today and sort of kick off the conversation around critical materials and also the context of Africa. It's my pleasure to have my colleagues here, Reitumetse and Loyce, talk about different sort of topics within that story. And I'll give you a bit of an energy transition technologies and critical materials. Sort of think of this as setting the scene. What's happening? Why is this interesting? And why is it evolving so fast? And why is it so complicated? Sorry, I cut out a word there. So Critical Minerals Africa Summit. So straight into it, if this is working. Next, can I get a hand here quickly? There we go. No, this button's not working. Is this just done remotely? Sorry, can I get a... There we go. Thank you. Okay, so just a quick introduction to who we are. Project Blue, we're a market research consultancy. We look at critical materials relevant to energy transition, hence a nice fit for kicking us off for today. We're a global market intelligence company with footprint across the globe. We've got an office here in Stellenbosch with about 20 analysts, a big team in the UK as well as a growing team in China in terms of where sort of our research hubs are taking place. We look at raw materials across the board, so this is understanding supply dynamics, demand dynamics, so from antimony to vanadium. Slowly but surely we're trying to recreate the periodic table here right now, still in alphabetical order, so that it's a bit easier to read. As some of us are geologists and not chemists, but we're learning a lot along the way to understand all these differences. In order to understand the dynamics of critical materials, we have to understand what are the key drivers. So you saw my title is about technology, and so it is this what sort of spreads developments in industries. On the introductory video, we had images of batteries, we had images of motors, of electric motors. There was an aircraft turbine in there as well. So all these different technologies drive different raw material demand. So what we do as a company, we collate all this research, we talk to the whole supply chain and deliver the support to understand those supply chains. And we've got some fun visuals and tools that we build to help our clients navigate the risks in the space. But so what are the key drivers of commodity markets, right? So over here, you've got a wheel looking at demographic shifts, markets and currencies, of course. You know, if you're looking in an African context, the export market is important. So, you know, US dollar exchange rates have a huge impact on markets and revenue upside. Policy and regulation, really central right now. Macroeconomics, of course, normal to general growth. New technologies is one we're going to end off with. Environment and sustainability. ESG is a conversation we've starting to become more familiar with. But to start off, I want you to just spend a couple minutes on geopolitics because there's quite a lot happening. Today is an important day. We've had a few elections come through in Southern Africa, but also a few of us have all been on our phones looking at what's happening in the USA and watching Trump take over the majority vote in the US. And that will have certain implications for the markets, right? So government changes, we've seen flip-flopping in the US now for some time, uncertain policies related to that, tariffs and trade wars central to that. Just this morning we saw, you know, China sort of holding back a war chest of potential ammunition of what it can use in the critical material space to insert dominance. Techno-security conflicts, you know, the Red Sea travel passage has been closed for some shipping for some time, redirecting supply chains. All of this has varied impacts on the overall market. Oh, I've done something to do this again. There we go, it's going the wrong way. There you go. So I've really touched on that, right? So it's a year of unprecedented voting in terms of how many humans went to voting booths this year. Trade sanctions are, you know, more and more. You've got Europe and US putting together tariffs on Chinese materials to try and boost the local economy. You know, after 20 years of decentralizing industry and then now coming to a stage of new technology and recognizing that one's actually 20 years behind the largest competitor, which is in China, sort of trying to understand how to navigate that. All of this is important to the context of technology as well. Inflation Reduction Acts, Critical Material Acts, so you've got governments and policies coming into play to enable to incentivize new technologies and supply chains to really help build this out. Whether it's all positive is another conversation, right? Inflation Reduction Act was released and all of a sudden lots of projects aimed for Europe changed tack and went to the USA. So it's not just competition against an established market in China or in Asia, but you've got growing economies competing for raw material supply chains. And think Africa in the back of your mind here. So opportunities for Africa in a global geopolitical climate. Right here, I'm just showing you a supply chain map for rare earths. Now, rare earths used in a variety of fun technologies. Those of you taking photos now are thanks to rare earths. If you've got a magnet in there, your sound and speakers and your electric motor for electric vehicles don't really work to the capacity and technology without it. Really, you've had Central Africa and some sort of heavy mineral sands, so quite simple mining sort of into the supply chain. If you go back a few years, Africa was sort of void of the rare earth supply chain, as the rest of the world is trying to build out policies. But you can see what geopolitics is doing. It's complicating supply chains, right? You had a trade war between Japan and China, and Japan had to develop this whole supply chain from Australia through to Malaysia via Vietnam and Thailand into Japan. Used to get all of that from China. But trade relations have an important impact on that. And there are opportunities and there are challenges related to all of this. So what is driving the overall development? It's new technologies. So let's go into that and then go into some of the examples. So I'll talk to you about lithium-ion batteries and lithium. Then I'll hand over to Loyce to tell you a little bit about the copper story and to Reitumetse to tell you about Cobalt. So what's happening here, right? Electric vehicles, you go back 5 years, it's really not something we were talking about. If you've been coming to all the conferences here at the CTICC, go to the mining indaba, there was no conversation around lithium. It was all still copper, gold. And that has really changed over the last 5 years, so much so that there's sort of dedicated sessions, conversations around electrification taking place and the impacts. So that it took quite long to get into the African context. But to show you some of that data here, the penetration rates of electric vehicles, you can see how quickly this is going into China. Europe catching up as well. US will probably see a slowing with the Trump presidency to some extent, although that we have a sort of Elon Musk upside potential based on recent conversations. So we're still waiting to see how that friendship is going to pan out. But it's not just about batteries. So you can see here the battery pack is a massive thing. This weighs a lot of kilograms, but it's about the motors over here, which need some copper. You need your rare earth permanent magnets. This is really important because without that, you've just created an energy storage system, which 6 months ago when we had load shedding was a great market in South Africa. And it's different technologies, right? If you climb into the new BYDs, the technology, the electronics in there, they are top class. Porsche launched its vehicle in Macau a few months ago. And the quality difference between an internal combustion engine, where you had Porsche versus entry-level vehicles, was massive. But now in electric vehicles, that gap is changing. So what is the purchasing incentive for us who need to buy a car to go from A to B to buy certain vehicles, whereas we can get it for relatively cheap from China, where the quality is leading the way? I mentioned it's not just about batteries and EVs. So here we take a look at what goes into air engine turbines or frames, lightweighting. We've built a model to understand why Rolls-Royce is actually doing so well, because Boeing's not doing so well, and Rolls-Royce is more associated with Airbus. And understanding the supply chains, right? We've got different parts. We've got parts people here in the audience today who sell parts, needing to understand their feedstock supply, and they pass on. So it's a complicated supply chain. We've got unique parts. These are complex materials. These are complex technologies. Electronics. This brings you back into a Taiwan conversation. Semiconductors, there's sort of a silicon shield for Taiwan. US-China politics really central to this. But the actual materials, it's not just about the semiconductor. If you break that down, gallium, germanium, silicon, right? These are central to building that out. Hafnium, which you only get hafnium if you actually make nuclear fuel cell rods. It's the only time you recover hafnium at this point in time. But you need that to go to space. So the point of this introduction is just to tell you how complicated the association of some of these raw materials are. It's not just we need battery, we need lithium. Lithium comes with boron as a byproduct in many of these cases. What's happening with boron? Are you going to flood that market? Is it going to break that out? There are really lots of complications in here. You mine for copper in the DRC, you get cobalt. You mine for it in South America, you get molybdenum. We need molybdenum because you get rhenium. Rhenium, again, is the reason many of us are here today, because we're allowed to do long-haul travels, and thanks to rhenium, the superalloys in an aircraft engine can operate at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Flying 15 kilometers from here to Washington is not possible without these critical materials. I'll skip that slide just for some detail. So, to finish off my introduction, so the technology landscape is getting complicated, right? The formulations, it's no longer make iron, make steel, add chrome, get stainless, right? It's lithium-ion batteries, NCM, which is nickel, cobalt, manganese. Do we use 80%? Do we use 60% nickel? There's been thrifting away from cobalt because of supply chain concerns around the formulation of that. Cobalt is now soared into surplus with CMOC investing in its copper mines, and we'll potentially hear more about that from Loyce. If you look at sort of lithium-ion battery forecasts from 5 years ago, there were about 5 formulations. And there was also a bit of uncertainty as analysts. We were still finding our way. But now, we're tracking over 30 different cathode chemistries into batteries. Lithium iron phosphate is something that has completely changed the forecast. So the risks of the demand and requirements for materials is evolving. Right? So it's really important to understand these technological developments. You've got lithium solid-state batteries. Are they a reality? What are the hurdles? So, I'm throwing a bunch of questions out here for you. Regionality. This is where criticality comes in. Critical materials is supply chain risk. It's different for each country. You've got people looking at what's important for their economies. We need materials for that. Then you get supply chain strategies, which is where Australia and Canada are looking at where to offer an alternative source of supply and opportunity to gain value. And the technologies will vary within that. Europe and USA has invested in nickel manganese cobalt formulations because that was the technology. They've put a lot of capital in there. Then China's actually invested a lot in lithium iron phosphate. It's a lot cheaper, entry-level EVs, you can use those. Now, the CapEx is already into these other formulations in Europe, so they're kind of stuck. Losing competition, so it's about being ahead of the game, and China really much in terms of its demand. There's space for more technology here compared to these smaller growth markets. So again, just adding another complexity to that. And then within that, so showing you here, this is our lithium cost curve on the mines. So this is a forecast curve to 2034, where we've incorporated all of the projects that we see coming online by 2034 and what the shape of that cost curve looks like. Prices are now sitting around $10,000 a ton, so you can see that where we're sitting in terms of the profit margin for many of these projects. This is related to demand not materializing as fast as was expected, but the build-out capacity has been massive, majority in China, and supporting on mineral supply chains, a lot of this coming out of Australia. DLE, this is sort of new direct lithium extraction technology coming into the pipeline, and various other supply chains in here. So for many of these markets right now, they're depressed, and this has to do with demand not being rationalized to the same expectation and capacity having built out to a rapidly growing market opportunity. So that's why we're seeing depressed prices at this point in time, and we see different projects closed down. There were certain battery projects that have been shut down in Europe for the past few months, one after the other. And at the same time, you can also see some of the downstream OEMs trying to understand their upstream supply chain and actually build out supply chain agreements within that. And understanding where to go for this, what type of mineral, what supply chain. And this is upstream. You need to go through all the different steps. You've got lithium out the ground, lithium carbonate or hydroxide, depending on what battery technology you're using. Where's the PCAM made? Where is the battery put together? And then how is that battery pack inserted into the electric vehicle? So lots of questions around this market in here. Okay. Maybe if I wave this too often, there you go. So what we do is we map out where the supply chain is. So I'll just skip through this so I can hand over and we can go into some of the interesting copper cobalt conversations. Is here showing you the mine side, and if I move forward, sorry, bear with me, there you go. You can see if I look at this, what happens here with a lot of mining happening across the globe. If you look at the refining section, a lot of that moves to the northern hemisphere, but specifically across over to China. So, setting the scene for our next two speakers is, can Africa play a central role, and depending on how you show your map, Africa's in the middle, to energy transition? And there really is a race for African raw materials to certain extents. There's lots of questions. You have to understand the cost structure of the types of materials. Lithium out of Namibia or the Northern Cape in South Africa are small deposits. Lithium out of Zimbabwe is doing exceptionally well and has actually potentially replaced some other projects that were expected in the near term, or at least delayed them. But specifically, we're talking about as well here investment into Central Africa. So a key battleground in terms of understanding raw material supply chains. The Tazara Railway you see over here, and we'll have more discussions about this tomorrow, I believe, it's been in place for a while, but there's different engineers, one from Germany, one from the UK, who built the railway, so the gauge is different. So the cost of moving material here is complicated by that. The Lobito corridor has recently seen a lot of investment from the US, and you can see here a statement from, it was 9 hours ago when I made this, in terms of supporting this corridor and investing in that, opening up supply chains, so you can see the West investing back into Africa. The response to that was China coming back in and saying, well, okay, let's upgrade this rate. Because if you look at this is from a tool we've built, you can select any dots in here and map them together. So Lobito corridor, about 1,700 kilometers, Tazara 24, Durban, which is where you see most of the trucking routes exit out of the DRC, about 3,000 kilometers. So 10 days of travel time here. It can take up to a month, depending on delays along the route. And again, so these are sort of minimum travel times. But this opens up opportunity. It opens up cost competitiveness. So the Europe-US corridor via Lobito is a lot shorter, so it's a reduced cost. Logistics, when you're in Africa, is a key portion of your cost structure. So it's an important part to understand. Right. We're going to move over to copper now. And just wanted to finish with this slide from my perspective to say it's not just about one technology. There are a bunch of technologies related to energy transition, solar, wind, electric vehicles and General Motors, and anything you can think of. So copper is really getting a lot of attention, and so let's dive into a little bit more on that with Loyce. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As introduced by Nils, my name is Loyce Mpangala, and I cover and I analyze the supply chain of copper. I cover mines, smelters, and refineries. And this afternoon, I'll be giving an overview of the global distribution of copper, specifically highlighting Africa's role within this landscape. To set the scene, we're first going to take a look at the current distribution of copper mine production, whereas for 2024, we're expecting the global copper output to be about 22 million tons. In terms of regional shares, we are seeing that Latin America remains to be a dominant player, accounting for the majority of the supply, about 38%, followed by Asia with 18%. Africa, color-coded with green, will have a share of about 17% in 2024, followed by North America and Europe with 10% shares each. And lastly, we have Oceania and Middle East, which will have shares of 4% and 2% respectively. Now, focusing on Africa's contribution, as illustrated in the second chart, the Democratic Republic of Congo accounts for the majority of the copper that's produced from Africa, about 76%, followed by Zambia, producing about 18%, and the remaining African nations make up the balance. In terms of volume, we're expecting the DRC to produce about 2.9 million tons in 2024, and Zambia to produce about 0.7 million tons in 2024. And with these significant production figures, it is not a surprise that the DRC ranks as the second largest copper producer in the world, and Zambia holds the 10th position. And also this highlights the critical roles that both Zambia and DRC play in the supply chain of copper. As we have been mentioning, and as Nils has said, that we are currently moving in a greener energy future where copper is essential in green energy, in renewable energy technologies, in electrification, and in electric vehicles. And even in response to the growing demand, we've seen a rise in increased investment in both of these countries in terms of increasing their mining capacities, improving logistics, and overall, these developments will help sustain their dominance in the global copper market. Now, focusing on DRC's production, over the last few years, where it's currently at and in the near-term future, we see that as of 2024, as circled in the yellow, DRC has surpassed Peru as the world's second largest copper producer. And as I mentioned earlier, we're expecting DRC to produce about 2.9 million tons, which represents a 5.6% increase of production from its last year's production, whereas we're expecting Peru's output to fall to about 2.6 million tons. And although Peru remains to be a key player in the copper market, DRC's notable growth can be attributed to several factors, of which I'll be highlighting a few of them now. The first key factor is the substantial involvement of Chinese companies in the DRC mining industries, we see that these companies control about 70% of the country's production, and they have invested significantly in terms of mining operations and essential infrastructures. And we have seen it in the last couple of years, whereby DRC has managed to more than double its percentage share up to now, surpassing Peru. But when we look at Peru's copper mining industries, we see that the companies involved are more diversified. The second reason is that generally the DRC mines have higher ore grades. For example, Kamoa-Kakula mine has a grade of about 5.5. There's another mine called Tenke-Fungurume has a percentage grade of about 2%. And when we compare that to the grades in Peruvian mines, they average about 0.6. And this has been an issue when it comes to Peru and Latin America in general, is that their grades have been falling, which has been affecting their production and will be affecting its production in the coming few years. The third reason why we see this big jump in DRC's production is the fact that it has benefited from several new greenfield projects, namely Kamoa-Kakula, Tenke-Fungurume, and Kinsanfu, which has boosted its production. And Kamoa-Kakula alone, it ranks among the 10 biggest copper mines in the world. And now in 2024, it has completed its phase 3 expansion, meaning that it will be able to produce about 600,000 tons of copper per year, which is a big jump from its previous capacity, which was 430 tons of copper per year. And that will make it the third largest copper mine in the world, meaning that DRC's copper production will increase even more and more. And comparing that to mines in Peru, most likely in the previous years and in the coming few years, they are relying more on brownfield expansions. And even with the brownfield expansions, they are often met with delays and slow ramp-ups. And when it comes to stability, the DRC is relatively stable, facing fewer local issues with the local communities when it comes to mining activities, whereas Peru often faces frequent labor strikes, disruptions, and social unrest with the indigenous communities. And despite these differences, I just want to highlight that both the DRC and Peru are key players in the copper market because of the byproduct extractions, which enhance their copper mining viability. The DRC benefits from cobalt extractions. My colleague Reitumetse will be talking about cobalt in a short period of time. And then Peru benefits from molybdenum and rhenium extraction. To conclude, my final slide highlights the African nations that currently have or are planning to have midstream and downstream copper capacities. As we know that traditionally, Africa was producing copper in the form of concentrates, but now we are seeing a shift in the sense that there is a growing midstream capacity in terms of increasing smelting capacity and also being able to produce refined copper cathodes by using SX-EW technologies. And we're even seeing we're beginning to see investments in downstream capacities, as recently Hailiang announced that they are planning on opening a SEMI's expansion in Morocco, so we'll be able to produce wire rods. And just to finish up, to summarize, is that Africa is evolving we're moving beyond being a raw exporter of concentrates to becoming a more diversified participant in the supply chain of copper. Thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Oh, thanks. Okay, so I'll be covering more about the cobalt supply chain. Yeah, so firstly, when looking at the cobalt supply chain, it's important to actually notify that within the cobalt market, you just don't have the actual concentrate, but you also have your intermediates and you also have your refined material. And all of these different markets can actually impact whether your prices would be going up or down, or increasing or decreasing. And when talking about cobalt, it's mostly produced as a byproduct of nickel and copper deposits. And from an African perspective, this would be highly highlighted in terms of copper production from the DRC and Zambia. Okay. So over the past couple of months, there has been an oversupply of intermediates production, and this is because of cobalt production as a byproduct from copper deposits. And this has really increased, this has really created a surplus in the market whereby prices have really been plummeting. Coupled with that is that there has been a decrease in demand for cobalt, mainly because it's used in your cathode chemistries for your lithium-ion batteries. And also in aerospace, there has been certain cases whereby demand has been really at a decline because cobalt is mostly used in the engines of your super alloys. So based on maintenance or aircraft deliveries, that does actually also impact the demand of cobalt. So in terms of production, the ramp-up has been really driven by production, and in the DRC currently produces around like 70% of cobalt production. And as you can see on the graphic on the right-hand side, you see that the major production in terms of increases for an oversupplied market has been really from CMA's DRC mine, because they did start production from their Tenke and Kinsanfu projects, and at the moment they actually produce around 85 kilotons of cobalt, and that's even 125% higher than their actual production guidelines for this year. So already there has been a really increase in cobalt production, and that has been plummeting prices. And additionally, there has been cobalt production from Indonesia. So in Indonesia at the moment, cobalt is produced as a byproduct of HPAL plants, and this has also been really affecting the market, whereby prices are furthermore plummeting. Okay. So overall, when looking at cobalt demand, historically, when looking at batteries specifically, cobalt was actually used in portable electronics. But over the past 10 years, the major driver for cobalt demand has been electric vehicles, especially in NCM or NCA battery chemistries. And this has really been the major part of why cobalt demand has been growing so much, and we see it actually still increasing despite the decline in prices. In terms of super alloys, as mentioned earlier on, cobalt demand is mainly used in your aerospace industry, and that is something that's still slowly recovering after the COVID pandemic, when it affected the aerospace industry. But at the moment, production demand is really relatively gentle and not on fast track. Whereas other markets includes industrial metals and chemicals, and this is mostly related to your pigments, whereby cobalt is used in that area, or your carbides or your tool materials, but this is mainly based on GDP and industrial production. So when looking at demand, we see that there is significant demand in terms of the cobalt market, and the question now is, will there be enough refined supply to actually meet this demand? So ideally, yes, and the bigger contributor to the refined supply would still be China, because Chinese companies are actually producing majority and consuming majority of the cobalt market in terms of your chemicals and your metals. At the moment, Chinese companies are also increasing their capacity despite the decline in prices, and this is just because cobalt metal is actually it's produced more for a premium in comparison to chemicals. Okay. So when looking at Africa and its role in terms of the cobalt supply chain, the first thing is that cobalt will still be produced as a byproduct of copper. So the more you have copper production, the more you'll still have more cobalt into the industry. And that's a role that the GRC actually plays a big role. And then in terms of nickel, as a byproduct, this in Africa, we don't actually produce as much nickel. So as a resultant, there isn't really much in terms of byproduction for cobalt. And then when looking at the refined side of the cobalt market. So what's been happening recently is that a lot of projects have actually been increasing the capacity within the DRC, and that has been increasing cobalt supply. But in terms of downstream, a lot of investments have actually been taken into different mining companies within the DRC, but also even Morocco as a very, I guess, a very influential part of the supply chain, as Nils mentioned earlier on, whereby Western regions are also trying to take in more, and FTA agreements are playing a big role in terms of geopolitics for cobalt supply within Western regions. So at the moment, refined supply has been, there has been developments in refined supply for cobalt, and this is for cathode chemistries, whereby there are production facilities that have been planned to be developed in Morocco by big Chinese companies. And at the moment, also even Managem and Glencore are developing a refinery that will be producing more cobalt sulfate, so still looking into the battery market. In Africa, there are some key producers also, where you have Ambatv, which has been a very historical producer for cobalt briquettes. So this would be mostly for the super alloy industry, and that has been increasing production. And at the moment also we have Lifezone Metals, which is in collaboration with BHP and has been receiving sufficient financial backing to actually improve and develop their project in Tanzania. And as a result, they're looking into producing more cobalt sulfate as well, whereby you would have an increase in also refined production. In the DRC, there have been also a lot of investments in certain projects. For example, ERG is actually developing a refinery in the DRC, the Commit refinery, whereby it's planning also still into producing cobalt sulfate. And then we have other projects such as the STL and Umicore collaboration, whereby it's more of refined production instead of producing. So historically, cobalt used to, the DRC used to be a very big producer of raw materials, but not necessarily the intermediates. So that's what has been happening. And it's a big collaboration because Umicore is also a very big producer in terms of refined cobalt within the Chinese market. And just last month, they actually started producing, exporting material to the European markets. So another project is the Busena project, which is mainly going to be developed by the DRC government, and they have invested around $3.5 million to actually produce this refinery, whereby it will be using artisanal feedstock material to actually produce cobalt chemicals, so your cobalt sulfate still. And then looking at the logistics in terms of the cobalt supply chain, the DRC mostly exports its material through the Durban port, and this has been something that has been used for the past for the longest time. But at the moment, because of the development of the Lobito corridor, this has created a window for Western regions to actually be receiving cobalt material. And as a result, we actually have been seeing a lot of cobalt supply agreements really being announced from the DRC into rest of the world companies, not just Chinese companies, and this includes, as shown there on the image, different key producers for cobalt, which is Glencore, CMA, and ERG, contributing more than 50% of the cobalt demand, cobalt supply, and really making investments and agreements with downstream producers within the US. Such as Electra. As you can see, Electra has a lot of supply agreements with the key producers, and this would be still used to produce cobalt sulfate. So overall, cobalt, there's a lot of investments to develop in it, and the DRC is a very significant producer in terms of especially looking at the different Western regions, and it could capitalize on the Lobito corridor as well to reach other international markets. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to just start by thanking, the organizers for the invitation to be able to present here. This is the first time attending this summit, and very much looking forward to the engagements. Let's see if I can get this remote to work. Try again. There we go. This is home for all of us. Today, it's the single source of essential minerals and metals needed to sustain economic development globally. The surface of the Earth is about 71% water, 29% land. Mining on this planet started 9,000 years ago when copper was first used in the Bronze Age. We've mined about 700 million tons of it to date. In 2022, the planet's population topped 8 billion people. That's up from 1 billion in 1820, 3 billion in 1960, and 7 billion as recently as 2012. That's also home for many of us, the urban environment. Delhi in India has an official population of 34 million people. In 1950, Delhi had a population of 1.3 million people. Sao Paulo, Cairo, Mexico City, Beijing, and Mumbai all have over 20 million people. Kinshasa and Karachi, 17 million. The global population is urbanizing. About 60 people on the planet are living within these urban areas, and by 2050, it's estimated that 7 of 10 people will live in urban areas. That's about 7 billion people. Here's one of those cities. There's energy as the lights and traffic is flowing. There's an extensive transportation and infrastructure system. It's full of homes, schools, places of work, hospitals. There's many benefits to urbanization: infrastructure, schools, healthcare. That photo, though, represents megatons of metals and mineral stocks harvested across history and now embedded in the built environment. Looking ahead, India and Africa are expected to drive this demand to mid-century. In a single photo, beyond the cyclicity of short-run changes in supply and demand, what we're looking here is the long-run demand for many metals and minerals. We're essentially seeing a structural shift. Different cities have different intensities of youth. Younger cities tend to start off more metals intensive, and as they grow, they become less metals intensive. Now, there's a new disruptor: decarbonization of the energy system in response to climate change. Essentially, what we're looking at is a re-engineering of the global energy ecosystem that's even more minerals and metals intensive than the current one. We've reached a tipping point, however. Base demand combined with that from the energy transition is leading to structural changes in the long-run balance of supply and demand of these metals. Here is the long-range outlook for copper. This was a projection out to 2050 from a bank report a few years ago funded by our Climate Smart Mining Initiative. Why are we looking at copper? While it's not critical to, as certain countries define it, not certainly to every country, but it is a barometer of macro trends regarding economic growth, poverty reduction, and building up the urban environment. The chart on the left is total copper demand. Blue is the base organic demand associated with basic economic growth. The yellow is the incremental addition through renewable energy generation, and the green is the result of decarbonization of the transport system. On the right-hand side, you see supply. In blue, we're looking at primary supply. It doubles. In green, we're looking at secondary supply, essentially recycling. That triples by 2050. Poverty reduction and global economic growth, starting with access to energy, are the key drivers of the mining industry over the next 25 years. In 1984, Business Week ran an article that said, "The death of mining." While that projection was wrong, it was right on public sentiment. Many advanced countries assumed that they could just secure their minerals from various parts of the world, and as long as they had secure supply at low cost, they were happy. 10 years later, in 1995, the US Congress voted to close the Bureau of Mines. Almost $100 million of research and 1,000 employees were gone. Like so many, the US government reasoned that metals and minerals were abundant globally, and that a highly connected global economy would face few barriers to trade and they could access these minerals. The mining industry was one of the first to go global in a highly connected global economy. I'm going to go through this a bit quickly because it's been covered by the previous presentation, but essentially fast forward to 2024 and things have changed considerably in this multipolar world. The US has gone with the Inflation Reduction Act, and we'll see if that survives the Trump presidency, but many other countries have followed: the EU, Australia, Canada, Japan, the UK. And of course, there have been players in this space long before, with massive foreign-based industrial policies securing minerals all over the world. So with all of this demand on securing minerals, it's really striking to see this forecast from S&P out to 2027. What you're looking at is access to capital, or basically exploration investment in the mining sector. In 2024, we're in the second year of decline of access to capital, and it still remains a challenge. All the regions have declining expenditures against surging demand, and investors are shunning many possible investment destinations, citing excessive country and sector risks. The other complication is that the average lead time from discovery of a mineral resource to the construction of a mine is 16.3 years. This is in striking context with the International Energy Agency statements that says that the technologies needed to carry out decarbonization and the energy transition need to be in place by 2035. That's only in 11 years. There is a real material constraint to the building out of the renewable energy technologies needed to decarbonize and mitigate climate change. So what's happening? Why are so many investors reluctant to invest in exploration and mine development? Let me just move this along. For years at the bank, we've been polling investors about what do they need, what is it that they want to invest in a country. What we find is that about 5.5 out of 6 of these factors reside in the hands of governments. Geological potential is primary. Either you have it or you don't. But why this one is half in the hands of government is because the government needs to make a decision to A, invest in understanding the potential, and B, make a decision to then make that information public. The other, around the profitability of operations, is key. This includes the ability to repatriate profits. Security of tenure is important. Consistency of mineral tax and policy, and availability of infrastructure such as power, roads, rail, etc. In 2023, the bank noted that post-COVID, the world has changed. Countries are facing a crisis of crises. COVID has erased the previous gains. Poverty increased in 2023 and will again in 2024. 800 million people still lack adequate access to energy, food, water, sanitation, etc. 2 billion of the 8 billion people on the planet live in what the bank calls social poverty. 3.1 billion could not afford a healthy diet. Governments in 2024 are facing unprecedented headwinds. Here's the global economy. Percent global GDP on the left axis, shown in 5-year increments from 1990 until now. I think the takeaway from this is that from 2020 to 24, this is the weakest start for a decade for global GDP growth since the early 1990s. 1 of every 4 developing economies are poorer now than they were before COVID. Government debt in commodity exporting countries has grown rapidly from 33% of GDP to 58% of GDP in 2022. 36 countries have fallen into or at high risk of debt distress, and global growth is projected to remain well below potential across the 2020s. And when discussing economic outlook, I think it's important to understand where are these pockets of poverty versus mining. Here's a 2024 distribution of global poverty. The percentage of those who live on less than $2.15 a day. These people are at risk. The map is aggregated at a country level. If you zoom in on one country, you would see that poverty is heavily concentrated in rural areas, exactly where mining occurs. This is that same map, but when we look at what we call our social poverty rate, $6.85 a day. It picks up many, many more mining regions. Again, especially if you zoom in at a subnational level. The mining industry, the global mining industry, is increasingly co-located in areas of profound poverty and income disparity. And I think we can agree that mines do not thrive in a community that fails or doesn't thrive as well. What needs to be done? At the World Bank, I think as much as we see these challenges, we also see the energy transition as presenting a real, unique opportunity for many mineral-rich African countries. We've started a global or a regional project focusing on a region defined within the bank organization as Eastern and Southern Africa. It's the group of countries shown in sort of the bluish hue. We're working across all of our institutions, not just ourselves as the bank, and which is IDA and IBRD, but also our private sector arms and our insurance guarantee agency. We're taking an integrated approach, which is needed to catalyze this opportunity, seize this opportunity and catalyze the minerals and metals essential for economic development and transition. We're supporting governments to ensure holistic mining development that yields socioeconomic benefits, including shared infrastructure, and for some, value-added processing of key energy transition minerals. And we're working to de-risk investors. The annual global investment required for mining is a staggering $1.7 trillion. We can bring a wide range of expertise and have in many countries, and typical achievements that we've had through our support to governments include extensive analytical work to identify which areas or where policy reform needs to be, enhancing legal and regulatory frameworks, enhancing capacity for governments to manage the sector, whether it be Ministry of Mines or the tax authorities or the Ministries of Environment. We work on modernizing mining cadastres and digitalizing them to give investors the confidence in license application processes. We invest in broad nationwide geological information acquisition. This has resulted in increased mine production across countries and positive socioeconomic development, fiscal impact, tax contributions, ASM formalization, and we do this with partners because ultimately no country can achieve this objective on its own, no development partner can support them on their own, and no company can do it on its own. And so for this opportunity to be seized across the region, we very much have to work together. This is a bit of an output of some of that modeling that we're doing. We've started in Zambia, we're working in Malawi, Burundi, DRC. What you're seeing here is a projection of copper on the left out to 2050. We look at it across a couple of scenarios. We call a business as usual scenario. It doesn't assume things don't change, it just assumes that things change in accordance to the current trajectory. and an unconstrained scenario where certain levers can be pulled by government to improve investment climate, improve the governance of the sector, capture the benefits, etc. We see copper increasing considerably, 1.5 times in the business as usual, 2 times, peaking at 2 times in the unconstrained scenario, up to about 7 million tons per annum. This is very helpful for us, not just because we want to understand out of curiosity how this sector is going to grow, but we need to understand how to support it. We need to understand how people can benefit from it and what those opportunities will be. And so we back out of these models tax and royalty contributions, employment demand, and the types of skills. Of course, it takes maybe 10 to 15 years for a mine to be built, but it takes about the same time for a new graduate to have enough skills and experience to be making decisions on those mines. So we need to start investing in that now. We back out of it the energy demand. It does take time to build hydropower, other renewable energy sources, so we need to know if that demand will be there in the future. And mining, because it's a high energy intensity industry, can be an anchor for many private sector investments in, for example, energy, but also in terms of transport. So we back out the freight demand, GHG emissions, water consumption, and the output ultimately is integrated country level and regional roadmaps with that coordination that I mentioned earlier. This is some other work that we've been doing. We've been looking regionally at some of the mineral occurrences and a few of the value chains that could be developed in an integrated way if countries were working together. In Eastern and Southern Africa, we've identified an EV battery cluster, but I should say it's broader than just EV battery clusters because there's many battery applications that are not used in mobility, but could have sources of local demand in the region. We identified a hydrogen cluster based largely off the ambitions of Namibia to be producing and exporting green hydrogen and ammonia and the need for platinum group metals, which are present in South Africa and Zimbabwe. We have an aluminium cluster as well. But I think in addition to these value chains, there's many others that are equally interesting, perhaps sometimes not as sexy. Copper, for example, copper into wires. The DRC and Zambia both have wire manufacturing capabilities, though it's low voltage wires. With these plans of the World Bank and the African Development Bank to invest billions in generating additional electricity for Africa, it makes sense if these players could be scaled up to produce not only in quantity but in quality high voltage cables to be used in those transmission power lines. Look, in summary, economic growth or infrastructure development and the energy transition are wholly dependent on a sustainable supply of mineral wealth and those value chains. Mining output needs to increase in multiples of today. The countries in which mining will occur are facing very, very strong headwinds. And recall, mining is located in some of the poorest parts of those countries. As a result, successful mining projects need to be framed as a part of a broader solution and part of an economic development strategy. The bank group, its client governments, industry, and other development partners need to work to leverage mining investments towards broader economic development, catalyze that infrastructure development using mining as an anchor investor, and let's see here. And in select countries, help to catalyze that downstream value addition for the manufacturing of energy transition technologies. Thanks for your time.
I think I'll start by touching a little bit on our company, considering that this is a minerals, call it side event to the African Energy Week. We are quite similar to, I guess, what I should call my colleagues at Project Blue, just presenting now. But we come rather from the energy side, whether that's fossil, electricity, and any sort of energy we're dabbling into. But we are also then, for the reasons obvious to anyone in this room, I believe, dabbling somewhat into the mineral side, and I'll provide some perspectives on that in my presentation. So starting with this chart. So again, despite the fact of this being a side event to the Africa Energy Week, in which coming, I think, from the head of that organization organizing the African Energy Week, it's a very much of a, call it drill baby drill mantra around that, and I fully support elements to that, of course. But in the wider scheme of things, looking at the entire world, there's a huge energy transition going on, and also relevant to Africa, I should say. So what this chart actually shows is our projection of the use of energy going forward, the end use, I should say, by the various energy bearers. So you have a fossil piece to the bottom, fossil fuels, electricity. Electricity has losses pertaining to it, which is the gray part that's coming up there. And then you have various other elements like biomass and biogas and such on the top there. This is showing this in an exajoule data set, and it's forecasters, you see it all the way to 2100. In many respects, if you look at the carbon budgets and such that are available to us as the world in terms of getting to different thresholds of global warming, we actually have most of what needs to happen ahead of us beyond 2050, which is very often where a lot of these forecasters stop. But you see the expedient change here, and there's all these reasons to discuss how quick that will be, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, what happens is energy transition means electrify everything you can, decarbonize electricity, i.e. generated from solar and wind, and stored through batteries, for instance. And it also means that we should clean up the residual, meaning that there's definitely also room for the likes of CCUS, direct air capture and such to get the last carbon out of the atmosphere. So one thing to observe on this is that maybe surprising, there's a continuous growth in the energy demand, as you see it here. It actually peaks and it goes down, which might be contrary to perception is why does that happen? Because what happens in the context of energy transition is also that it's not just the carbon aspect that changes, it also changes the material flow, or the material maybe not material, but tonnage intensity of energy as such. Today, a lot of the freight on the oceans, for instance, pertain to crude oil. When the fossil fuel piece and use of it falls in this way, less volume will be moved. But the volume that will be moved does move across to, for instance, the critical minerals value chain that many of the prior speakers have been speaking about. But the other element to this, which is on this chart, is that the system becomes much more efficient. It means that there's less losses from electricity systems, even when you fuel them by harder carbon fuels, which is gradually happening less and less, than there is in a direct hydrocarbon fuel system. So even though the sort of total energy consumption, including all the losses, as you see on this chart, actually peaks and declines a little bit and then heads straight forward, the useful part of energy availability actually continues to increase all the way to 2100. And that's just an observation from our side on how this actually evolves. So, as I said, material or volumes and tonnage moves from consumable elements more over to equipment and products for the purpose of the energy transition, for the purpose of electricity, and also not to mention vehicles, as was mentioned here. So when you look at the outlook that we have under the scenario you just saw, 1.8 degree global warming, all the way to 2050 in terms of what we call demand for materials from the energy transition sectors, which would be typically solar, wind, and storage technologies like batteries, and also transportation. You see that for the most part, a lot of this is the traditional stuff, right? It's iron and steel, it's glass, it's aluminum, cement, copper, plastics. So many of these elements are actually things that are being consumed quite extensively elsewhere as well. So in one way to think about it is if you look at this only, you would maybe think that, well, the extension of this value chain build-out is not really feasible. But when it happens in the context of the wider use of materials in society, which is what this is showing, then some of these domains, they grow immensely within energy transition sectors, yes, but they don't do that on the whole, because really they're just part of the general construction segment, for instance, that consumes a lot of cement. So here, same forecast. This is the entirety of demand for materials, cross-sectional in our view, also beyond energy, not to mention, where most is being consumed. And not surprisingly, given the growth of cities and things of that nature, construction remains an extremely important part of this. Consumer products follows then, packaging, and then transportation emerges. And you see the small slithers there are really the ones on batteries and renewable energy and such. And that was the prior slide I was showing, but they're growing in relative terms faster than all the other domains. Observing one more thing, the current demand for material as a whole, let's also include, for that matter, wood and things of that nature. It's around 9 billion tons per annum, and we're thinking it's going to increase towards 12 by 2050, which is driven both by expansion of populations, but also by more richer populations, if you will. But very sort of rule of thumb, it's around 1 ton of material consumed per capita globally per annum today. So looking a little bit back to the energy transition sectors, and I think it was good to see that some of this didn't become very different from our experts at Project Blue. But as was said earlier, due to the potential change in value chains around batteries especially, and the leftmost 5 minerals you see here, lithium or materials, cobalt, graphite, nickel, those are all the extent to which those value chains as a whole need to expand under the 1.8 degree scenario that we have to fulfill the overall transition element that adds to the overall use of this from the first place. So the really big kicker here is, and it's on a multiple basis, so it means that these numbers show how much these value chains need to grow at the extraction, for instance, at certain time frames going forward compared to today. It's not to say that lithium consumption is higher than copper, for instance. That's not the point. It's the relative trajectories. And on lithium, we see a future that whereby 2050, you likely will have to 12-fold the current situation in terms of lithium value chain availability. The same applies to cobalt, despite of the efforts to try to remove cobalt from the cathode elements to batteries. That's the same story. There's a huge market share within batteries that will remain reliant on cobalt, and we say that is going to have to be 5-folded, more or less. Similar graphite, almost 5, nickel 4, copper 2.5 times, more or less, and also aluminium around 3, which is, the latter 2 is more relating to call it the power system as a whole, even though copper, of course, is a key element to electric motors as well. So vast opportunity within these value chains in terms of expansion. It reminds me a little bit about the pre-shale oil age, where everything was supposed to happen in deep water. That didn't quite happen because shale happened. But it was these sort of multiples that were sort of visible in that industry, and this is a bit similar to that. So I'm speaking for much longer. I think a lot of the details to the specifics of Africa in this context has been touched on, and I think we can maybe then add for some minutes of questions towards the end. So I'll actually just close on this slide, but it's taking the same most critical 5 in terms of these multiples, minerals or materials, and thinking a little bit about where these are coming from. And if you look at the charts to the right, the yellow pieces to them are Africa, while as the purple rather is Australia, and so on and so forth. The red is China. So as you see, to some extent, there is a presence of Africa within these value chains in terms of the extraction of the minerals across all. Maybe not as visible on the lithium end, even though I know there's activity just north of South Africa on that too. The point being here that in the very big scheme of things, in my mind, it's very similar to the oil and gas situation that Africa finds it in terms of the global supply that Africa provides in that market. And there's just equal, call it, importance of Africa to sort of grasp the role of taking this market as well, and it's like valid share of it, if you will. And I guess that pertains to, as the World Bank individual talking earlier said, to the regulation aspect of making that happen. But it should definitely be so that Africa takes its rightful share here, if you put it that way. Okay. And this is basically what we need to make happen, the growth of these, for the transition to be viable globally. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, this is a great venue. I'd like to congratulate NJ, his wife Callie, for doing this tremendous Africa Energy Week, but also integrating critical minerals. For people like myself, our group have been working now on the continent for 36 years. I originate from Canada originally, but was very fortunate to get dumped into the deep end of Nigeria at a very young age, working in the oil and gas industry. And it's great that this venue kind of allows people like ourselves who are natural resource investors to kind of integrate and participate in energy transition. I was speaking on Monday about oil and gas opportunities in Nigeria, deep water Namibia, and now today we're speaking on critical minerals. And this continent is a wonderful place for us to actually contribute to the transition of energy, but yet maintaining what's important to the economies here is an active oil and gas industry. We can't stop drilling, we can't stop finding oil and gas, but we can utilize things such as natural gas, convert it into power, and also integrate and support the energy transition into critical minerals. I have two presentations today. There's two different groups that we've founded and are originating. The first one I thought was relevant, especially with what we're seeing in the presentations today and in kind of, let's say, the global transition of energy change. And this is really more pointed towards the U.S. and the U.S. securing critical minerals. This is an organization that we've recently founded called the Critical Minerals Vault. This clicker's a little bit slow, but we'll. There's just some recent highlights. U.S. government dumping billions and billions of dollars into manufacturing. Obviously now we'll see what happens with the election, but it looks like Mr. Trump may be back in the helm. He will push a lot for local manufacturing in the U.S. Even in the Biden administration, there was a lot of push towards securing non-China battery metal. They implemented import tariffs on EV batteries, 100% tariffs on Chinese-made EV cars, and I think you'll see more and more of that, probably a lot more aggressive with Trump in. The U.S. and allies have also formed what's called the Critical Minerals Partnership, and that's a partnership to secure critical minerals to become kind of anti-China per se, and not be non-reliant on China for critical mineral transition. Our group, Critical Minerals, is set up now to do basically buying of physical metal, putting that in warehouses in the U.S., acquiring streams and royalties on critical minerals, securing offtake rights. And this is just all really pointed towards critical mineral security, long-term security in the U.S. One of our companies that we founded in 2017 did exactly that. It was called Cobalt 27. We founded that company, we listed it, and we went out and bought a significant amount of cobalt and nickel streams and royalties and physicals. We raised over $1 billion in a very short time frame, about 15 months. Ended up ultimately selling that company to our largest shareholder, which is called Pala Investments. There's a large private equity fund based in Switzerland. Things that we need to really focus on is, and a lot of the presentations today will show, the risk in supply chain. And in the U.S., North America, the risk is they don't have enough metal to meet the demand. That's why we need to be relying on continents like Africa to help meet that demand in lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper. A lot of the presentations today also showed, the geopolitical issues surrounding critical mineral supplies and also government frameworks. So we need the right framework, mining codes, and government participation to allow us to extract and bring these critical minerals back into manufacturing hubs like Europe and North America. Important here is the need of critical minerals for the energy transition. Electric cars, not just the battery, but electric cars, significant amount of copper required. Obviously, you've seen the presentations today, the DRC, Zambia, significant producer of copper. So this continent can really be significant for energy transition. Lithium, although you see a lot of demand for lithium, but lithium is actually a very minor component in the EV compared to copper and compared to nickel and manganese and graphite. So once again, this continent has significant opportunity to contribute to the transition of EVs and also energy transition with wind power, solar, etc. U.S. Is significantly reliant on foreign countries, mainly China, for their refined product. But once again, I think especially now with this Trump administration, you'll see more and more manufacturing, which is great for the continent of Africa because it'll allow us to do more strategic relationships with the U.S. You're seeing the U.S. investing a lot into the continent. The DFC is putting a lot of money into the continent. They've recently announced a deal with Lifezone and BHP and the Kabanga development. We're talking to them about one of our projects we'll talk about in the future here in Cameroon. So once again, just when you look at the reliance on foreign metals that the U.S. has, it really sets Africa up to be the perfect location to be the choice of critical mineral supply for North America. Just once again, significant demand curves we've seen today, significant growth. Although commodity prices are low, that growth is still there and will remain there. And if there's a squeeze on China and U.S. companies, the Teslas, the Fords, the GMs, etc., to become non-reliant on China, and that'll happen by increasing tariffs. I think you'll see a lot of things happening in the U.S., a lot of the free trade zones, Canada, Mexico, foreign countries will probably go away and they'll push for more local manufacturing. We saw this slide earlier, the time frame to build a mine. I think the last slides earlier today were about 16 years. U.S. is sitting at the top. Interesting, next to Zambia. I was quite shocked to see this slide, actually, but that probably has a lot to do with just regulatory issues and constraints. But this is the issue with U.S., Canada, North American mines. You just can't get them on production in time to meet the demand, and that's why countries like the DRC, Tanzania, Cameroon, etc., can really fill that gap in the timeframes that are required. If we could slip to the next deck now. The next presentations are going to be really more on our Tronic Metals, which is a development exploration company. We founded this about 3.5 years ago, really to focus on critical minerals, and this was really a way for us to kind of continue with our oil and gas development, but also contribute to transition by investing and bringing investors into the critical minerals development. As I said, we've been on the continent for many years. My business partner and chairman of our group, Sir Sam Jonah. Sam was the CEO chairman of Ashanti Gold, and then when they merged with Anglo, he was the chairman of Anglo Ashanti. Sam's been involved in significant growth in the continent. He's been a friend of mine for 30 years and business partner. And together, Sam, myself, and our other business partners, investors have really focused on high-value critical mineral projects. Where we're focusing initially is in what's called the East African Nickel Belt. In Burundi and Tanzania. You saw some presentations earlier today about the Kabanga high-grade sulfide project, nickel sulfide being developed by Lifezone and BHP. Well, that whole belt that kind of runs from Zimbabwe, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, has a significant amount of nickel, probably about 15% of the world's estimated nickel is sitting in that belt. The project that we've also recently acquired, which a lot of people don't know about, is a very, very significant nickel, cobalt, manganese project called Nkamuna in Cameroon. It's one of the world's largest undeveloped primary cobalt assets. What's strategic about that asset is that it's kind of diversified out of the issues that you're seeing in DRC. DRC does produce a lot of copper with byproduct of cobalt, but DRC has a bad perception from an international investment standpoint. We find it very difficult a lot of times to bring foreign investment as a junior company. When you're Mr. Friedland with a $20 billion company, it's a little bit easier to attract capital. Chinese dominated, obviously, so they don't have an issue about raising capital. But guys like us, junior mining guys going to equity markets, DRC's been tough. So this Cameroon project is interesting to us because it has a lot of support from the US government, and it is a very, very significant cobalt, nickel, manganese, which is 3 of the 4 main components of a battery metal. The Cameroon project sits in southeastern Cameroon. It's a long way from the Caribbean port, but what's interesting is you're seeing another very interesting project called Mpangala. It's one of the world's highest grade iron ore projects that straddles Cameroon and Republic of Congo. That's being developed. It was originally developed by Sundance, an Australian company. Unfortunately, they had a very tragic accident with most of the executives who died in a plane crash in the Cameroon. But that's now being redeveloped by a consortium of Chinese and local groups, and they're building a railroad over to the Caribbean port. That railroad's about 60 kilometers from our project, so that's good for infrastructure in the future. It won't stop us from moving ahead and developing now and trucking to the port. Significant project. It was owned and developed by a group of technical guys out of Colorado, the U.S. They've had it for 17 years, spent about $130 million. It is a very well advanced project, has a SRK 43101 report, 323 million tons, 0.2 cobalt, 0.67 nickel, and 1.4 manganese, which ranks it as one of the highest undeveloped, proven cobalt nickel projects in the world. Also has a bankable feasibility study done by Lycopodium. The people that were developing it in the past were kind of, let's say, technocrats, and they couldn't really integrate the commercial side and ever really get this thing off the ground. So we were very fortunate to go in and strike a deal with the current U.S. owners. We bought them out. It was a bit complicated because they own 60.5%. The Cameroon investment arm, government SNI, owns 20%, and there was a group of local shareholders of 19.5% controlled by the Cameroon State Investment Company. It was very complicated, and let's say most foreigners looking in would not know how to deal with that situation or restructure it, but we were able to do that, and now we're fortunate where we're sitting on a significant project. Permit will expire in 28, but under the contract we have, the minute we start phase 1 production, which will be a pilot plant, and we export, then we can renew the license for another 25 years. So it's very fortunate for us to step into a project that's had $130 million of historical investment, bankable feasibilities, independent reserve reports. So we're just updating those reports now. You're sitting on a very significant asset, which our entry cost was not that much. This is where the project kind of sits. As you can see, it's sitting on the upper end of recoverable nickel equivalent. The grade's a little bit lower, but the grades are still okay, and we can upgrade it very easily. The fact that it's got 3 main components, the nickel, cobalt, and manganese, make it a very attractive mixed concentrate, and that's how we'll start initial production with a mixed concentrate, using DMS technology, magnetics, and some XRT sorting. Once again, you can see how it's very unique based on the blend of commodities we have in it with the nickel, cobalt, and manganese. The second project we're working on is in this East African nickel belt. And this is where the Kabanga nickel project's being developed, the world's highest grade nickel sulfite project. Had a long history. BHP originally were developing that asset in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Kind of went through a few ownership iterations. Glencore, Barrick actually owned it at one point in time, and then when they had some issues with the Tanzanian government, they relinquished it back to the government, and then it got picked up by a technology company called LifeZone. They have a patented hydromet technology process, which is the world's lowest emission hydromet processing technology. They acquired it, LifeZone did, and then BHP came back in as a 15% equity owner. And now BHP have the option to go up to a 51%. That's currently being done. It was based off an independent feasibility study. And they'll be buying in on an average of the 70% NPV of that project. So you'll see BHP increasing the equity. The other thing they're doing is they're building their processing plant. Now what's interesting is they're building their processing plant about 350 kilometers away in an old Barrick gold mining site called Kahama. To get to that site, they actually have to truck 350 kilometers. That sets us up very interesting for our Burundi projects. There's that whole belt. So you've got Kabanga, and the other project you see on the map is called Musongati. So Musongati was a historically drilled, advanced project in Burundi. It was drilled by a private Croatian company called BMM. They hired MSA out of South Africa to do all the technical work. It's got 140 million tons of nickel laterite and 40 million tons of sulfide with a lot of upside potential. That project when we got involved, we were working with the previous owners, BMM, and then they lost the acreage due to non-performance. It's back in the government's hand, and we went through a kind of a quasi-tender. So we've been shortlisted on that project alongside a Chinese company. But what this map wants to demonstrate is the infrastructure. This is why we think Burundi is a very, very strategic hub for critical minerals, especially nickel, and there is some PGMs. There's an existing railroad from Dar es Salaam to Kigoma on Lake Tanganyika. That's an existing rail that's working. The African Development Bank have actually funded now an extension of that project into Burundi, right up north of Musongati, which is where our licenses lie. So we'll actually be connected to a rail, and if you look at that Isaka on the map, that's actually where the BHP processing plant is going to be. So we're actually going to be connected via rail into the BHP Life Zone processing plant. So it makes Burundi very, very strategic for critical minerals hub. And there's significant potential in Burundi. And Burundi is a wonderful country to work in. They have a very good favorable mining code. It was recently adopted last year, enacted into law under presidential decree. It's very similar to the Tanzania mining code. So once again, there's a lot of reforms and codes coming in that really make it a conducive place for people like ourselves to invest. The other thing interesting in this region is the UAE through IHC. IHC is a very large fund run out of Abu Dhabi, controlled by the ruling family. They own a subsidiary called IRH, International Resource Holdings. That's the group that bought Mopani in Zambia. They're also working on an infrastructure project in eastern DRC. They would publicly announce a $1.9 billion infrastructure project for tin tantalum tungsten development. And they've been working with the government aggressively on building infrastructure in East Congo, right across the Burundi-DRC border. One of the things they'll be doing, and this is under a government-to-government contract, is building infrastructure. So their strategy is to extend that railroad that has been funded now by African Development Bank up a little bit farther north in Burundi over to DRC. It's great for us because it actually connects majority of our licenses to a rail system and infrastructure. It'll be interesting to see what Kabanga does, because if they have a rail that they can tie into through Burundi, much easier, better economics than trucking 350 kilometers over to their processing site. It could make for very interesting regional collaboration where you have a concentrate in Tanzania crossing a border into Burundi, going back into Tanzania and up to a processing plant. So we're sitting in a very interesting strategy, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for kind of a midstream infrastructure investment too. If you're controlling some of the infrastructure, it's a great way to charge tariffs on the concentrates coming through. So we're very well positioned and excited about how this project will evolve. This is just a map of our current licenses that we've recently acquired. One is called Cankuzo, which is a very large license that sits directly adjacent to Kabanga. The drilling that was done in Kabanga was also at the same time explored on the Burundi side. So we know that the opposite side of Kabanga, it's identical geology. It has less exploration work and appraisal work. And then we have two other licenses in the Bakiri-Waga, which sit directly north of that large Musongati project that I discussed earlier. Once again, this just shows the significant size of our Cankuzo license compared to the Kabanga license. So we think with further exploration, geophysics, and some drilling, there already has been historical drilling, which has proven high-grade nickel sulfide. So we think it's a very interesting region for significant upside. And the infrastructure coming in makes it extremely financeable. These are just some slides on the other projects that were historically drilled. The UN drilled it. A company called Lion Ore, Noraus Nickel. There's been a lot of historical work done in this region, but significant upside. And this belt, as I say, currently holds about 15% of the world's nickel, and it could expand and get bigger as we develop and explore regions like these licenses we have. As I'd mentioned, we've got significant team of people like Sam, our chairman, and a lot of technical guys, ex-BHP, MMG guys. So we've got a lot of experience of guys. Dave Evans was with BHP for many years, one of the world's most renowned nickel geologists, East African nickel belt expert. A lot of the other slides in here we've already talked about, just kind of the growth, we're seeing significant growth demand for nickel, cobalt. Even though prices are depressed, I think there could be a shift in price if there's more pressure put on China. A lot of the battery metal that's environmentally friendly coming out of Indonesia, there could be restrictions on that, saying, look, these US manufacturers cannot buy any battery metal coming from those environmentally unfriendly sources. So that could hopefully help nickel and cobalt prices in the midterm. Once again, just everybody from Tesla to Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. Interesting company. It's called Cobalt. It's financed by Gates, Bezos, and a lot of other very large institutional and private family offices from around the world. They're working aggressively now in Africa. They've got a large project in Zambia they're developing. And next week, we actually have a large meeting with them. They're interested to coming in and talking to us about our projects. It's an AI technology-driven mining company, so a lot of AI computing and computer powers going into historical geological data and drill data to help delineate and best work out how to develop mines. So it's interesting. And in order, I think, to meet this transition, you need to work with new sources of investment. As you've seen, Gates, Bezos, Abu Dhabi guys. Traditionally we'd raise money in stock markets in Canada, London, but that's very difficult with the economy. So it's great to see new investment coming into the continent. To conclude, obviously, people always say, well, why are you guys in Africa? There's easier jurisdictions, but then you need to point out the significance of Africa and what we have. Everything from a $20 billion Ivanhoe company. Barrick's largest gold mine is Chalale in DRC. So significant projects. Tanke Furunke, MMG. It's a place to be, and it's the right place to be. We just need to work with local governments, communities, local content, and attract foreign investment to help us develop and help Africa become a significant player in the energy transition. Thank you.